Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in an afterlife? And if you do you believe that the dead will come back for unfinished business? There have been, of course, multiple accounts of hauntings. I speak, of course, of such things as the Freeling House poltergeist, the infamous haunting of Hill House, and of course, the alleged hauntings of the Overlook Hotel. But tonight's story, we will be looking at a small fishing village in Northern California by the name of Antonio Bay. One night in 1980, 6 people were murdered. 6 murders that are still unexplainable to this day. Now, we will go further into the story, and also another story that connects to what I am about to tell you. But on one night, on April 21st in 1980, a fog bank rolled into Antonio Bay, and the town was changed forever. Welcome back, dear listener, to The Monsters We Make. I am your host, Mr. Multiverse. And tonight, we talk of a tale of revenge from beyond the grave. As always, this is a story of true horror. So if you wish not to subject your nerves to such a strain, now's your chance to, well, we warned you. As I said, our story begins in Antonio Bay, which still stands to this day. Antonio Bay is, as I said, a Northern California town. It's mostly a fishing village, in fact. It's a quaint little village. It's nothing too special to most people. The people who live in Antonio Bay are very secluded, I would say. But they are, as with most of these small towns, and I do say most, they are very welcoming to tourists. In fact, they welcome any tourists, especially when it's regarding the story I'm about to tell. Now, to tell this story, as I said, I need to speak of another event that happened that actually ties into the founding of Antonio Bay. There are several records of the founding of Antonio Bay. And there are things that did come to light shortly thereafter this event. So, in order to properly tell the story I'm about to tell, I must tell the first one. There have been various accounts, but the most important one comes from John Manchin, a now past shipman. He was a crab fisherman and a captain of his own vessel. But on his off time, he would basically be something of a scoutmaster for a small group of boys around town, and he would take them out into Antonio Bay, along the rocks and along certain campsites, and tell them stories. He did this for free, and he did this because he felt that the history of Antonio Bay should not be forgotten by anyone. This is a picture snapped of John Manchin with some of the boys that night that started it all. Around midnight, according to this story of the founding of Antonio Bay, it involves a man known only as Blake, and along with him, he and his crew of his ship, the Elizabeth Dane, had made a bargaining with 6 founders of the town. But how did they get this money, you might ask? Unfortunately, Blake was a very wealthy man, but he was also afflicted with leprosy, along with the rest of his crew and other shipmates, and even members of his own family were aboard that ship. Blake, alongside the 6 founders of Antonio Bay, made a negotiation to basically form a leper colony just outside of the town. Now, The founders, however, while they did agree to Blake's wish, and he did pay in advance with gold, they did not wish to have a leper colony anywhere near them. So as our records understand, fire along Sea Point, that bird, the portals of the Elizabeth towards the docks. It's also important to note that there was a fog bank that rolled in at the same time that impaired Blake's killing and drowning everyone on board. So important to know went and finished the job of anyone who survived that grounding. Now, you may be asking, what does this story have to do with the one that you are here to listen to? I will explain. I must stress that a lot of this is a lot of hearsay, and while we have loose images of certain people, it's still difficult to say what exactly happened that night on April 21st, 1980. But we do have coroner reports. We have eyewitness testimony. People who are still alive to this day, actually. But the problem is there wasn't enough people who saw this event. And we'll be taking in eyewitnesses' accounts. We'll be taking in reports, police reports. And I want you to leave this up to you by the end of it. One of the most important figures in this story is Stevie Wayne. Stevie Wayne was a disc jockey in Antonio Bay. She ran a show called The Witching Hour, which was from midnight to, I believe, 2 a.m. She would basically play smooth jazz and other kind of requests from the local townspeople, and she would also keep up with news updates, weather reports mostly, for fishermen that were doing late night fishing. It was a pastime, though it was less about fishing and more of getting drunk while your wife wasn't around. Such was the case the night of April 21st, midnight. Report from the local Dan the weatherman informed him that there was a fog bank rolling in. Stevie, of course, related as nothing, but there was a boat, a fishing boat, out in those waters that night. Now, we don't know what happened. The reports are still hazy. But what we do know is that the mayor's husband, Al Williams, and two other crew members were aboard that boat fishing, though judging by the reports from the harbor master saying that there was a large amount of beer cans, it didn't seem like they were fishing for anything other than more alcohol. But that's beside the point. From what we understand about what happened next, around 12:30 a.m., something happened where all three men were found brutally murdered the next day. It's very clear that someone boarded this boat. The bodies of the three men were found not with gunshot wounds, but more along the lines, from what we understand of the coroner reports, that the various bodies were stabbed by various bladed weapons, and by some even what appeared to be hooks, similar to the Caprini Green killings, just as a mention from another case I had spoken about earlier. We don't know what happened, but we don't know what exactly happened, but it was very clear that whoever boarded this vessel were multiple figures, judging by the amount of there were waterlogged footprints, and that's going to be important in a moment. But it seemed as though they managed, whoever these strangers were, rolled in on the fog bank, came aboard Al Williams' boat, and managed to, it must have been more than one person, because the idea of one person coming on board a boat and killing these three men who were still, while they were inebriated, were more than capable of defending themselves. All three men were found murdered by these unknown assailants. What's also important is that nothing was stolen. And as I said, there were waterlogged footprints. Because what's most odd about these bodies, according to the reports, is that these three bodies seemed waterlogged, as if they had been drowned for hours. But the boat had not sank. There was no damage to the vessel. And there was no sign that these men had been thrown overboard. And it would be impossible to not only throw these men overboard and then pull them back up, but the amount of time that they would need to look bloated they would have to be underwater for hours, if not a day or so. And that's only one half of the story. Because at exactly midnight, just as the fog bank rolled in, the entire town was awoken by what some described as a power outage, some would say, but I've never heard of a power outage do something like this. Reports of that night say that every car alarm, every building alarm, everything just exploded in a cacophony of sounds. Every dog and cat, every pet in Antonio Bay went mad. They were barking, they were meowing, they were terrified of something. In the local grocery store, glasses exploded. According to one grocery boy who worked there, said that the various glasses exploded. Power went out, and every clock stopped at midnight. It's unexplainable of what happened. Now, our story has various players, and I'm going to do my best to talk about every person involved. Because some of them have deeper stories to tell. For one half of this story, we're going to have to tell the story of Elizabeth Solly and the harbor master, Nick Castle. This is a picture of Elizabeth here. Elizabeth was a drifter coming through town headed to Canada when she was picked up by Nick Castle, who was working a late shift. Now, I cannot speculate on what happened next, but it was said that Elizabeth was taken home by Nick to his house. Nick was unmarried, and I imagine that Elizabeth probably was very beautiful. The two did strike up a romance, as it is it has been said. And the following day, Nick, alongside Elizabeth, found Al Williams' boat drifting in the harbor the next day after the strange event the previous night. It was Nick Castle and Elizabeth Solly who found the bodies of Al Williams and his crewmates. After the boat was brought in, autopsies began. Now, what happened next as Nick was speaking to the coroner? There was a scream from inside the autopsy room. Elizabeth was left alone with one of the bodies. And what happened next? It was said that Nick went into the room and found the body laying on the floor with the number 3 carved with a scalpel into the floor. Elizabeth was obviously shaken, and she claimed that the body had stood up. Now, That's not all impossible that a body could, in theory, lift back up. It's more of the body and the gases expanding within the cadaver and making it look like it's sitting up. But the way Elizabeth said that the cadaver, had basically stood up from the operating table and approached her with the scalpel. Now we cycle back to another group of people I must talk about, because their sins, their apparent sins, are quite integral to this story. This is Father Patrick Malone, and Mayor Kathy Williams, the now unknowing widow of Al Williams. Behind in that picture you see is Nancy Loomis. She was Kathy's assistant. Father Malone was a former pillar of the community. Even before this, it had been said that Patrick Malone had become despondent. He had become unamused. He had been taken into alcoholism. He was starting to lose his faith in God. And that further proved it when he claimed he found a journal that is still locked in the museum of Antonio Bay. You see, Father Malone's grandfather was one of the 6 conspirators who murdered Blake and his leper colony. That part of history was, of course, kept out by Malone's grandfather and the 6 conspirators who used the gold from the Elizabeth Dane to build the town. Malone was despondent when he found this journal in the depths of his own church. He had no desire to be part of the centennial that was happening tonight, the 100th anniversary, and it was already starting strange. Now, Kathy Williams was, for lack of a better word, unaware that her husband had been murdered. She always knew her husband was a bit of a drinker and always a fisherman, and just assumed that he was just hung over in his boat. But she later found out from the local police that Al had been murdered. She wanted to be strong, but she was already breaking. Now, we cycle back to Stevie Wayne. Stevie had a son who was actually pictured in the earlier image of John Manchin, Andrew Wayne. Andrew Wayne, because of Stevie's, late night show, she would have to spend long hours in the lighthouse she owned. In fact, this is an image of the lighthouse today. It still stands in Antonio Bay. But because of this, she would work long hours and spend also days doing day shifts as well. She left her son in the care of a maid and a local babysitter by the name of Regina Kobritz. Mrs. Kobritz was the main caretaker, of Andrew Wayne when Stevie was not around. Now, according to to Miss Wayne, her son found a piece of wood that had the word Dane on it on the day of the centennial. She thought it looked nice and brought it to her studio. And according to her, a voice demanding retribution called damaging equipment when water from the sign itself. Of course, I cannot truly discern if that was true or not. There have been some cases where waterlogged objects do retain water and spill onto objects. Maybe one of the songs were playing and it just sounded so distorted that Miss Wayne simply thought that she was hearing things. But that does not explain what happened that night. Because you see, The fog came back, and the fog bank reached Antonio Bay that night. What follows is speculative, but again, we do have eyewitness accounts. Elizabeth Solly and Nick Castle detail that this strange fog bank rolled in, and this can also be corroborated by the former mayor before her death. The fog first rolled in and consumed the weather station. The fourth person to die in this whole event was Dan O'Bannon. According to what she heard over the radio, because she was talking to Dan over the radio, Stevie heard the sound of the door being opened, and Dan just throwing off the idea that this was just a bunch of teenagers looking to annoy him again. But the door opened, Dan screamed, and the sound of blades cutting flesh was heard. Autopsy reports of Dan O'Bannon's body show that a bladed object struck him in the face, and particularly both of his eyes, hitting so deep that they hit the back of his skull and killed him instantly. The body was, of course, also found waterlogged. Following that, the fog rolled further into town and began to reach out to Stevie Wayne's house. Stevie, in a fit of panic, was begging anyone who was listening that night of the centennial to reach her son before the fog could get there. Castle and Solly were the first people to reach the house, but not before Regina Kobritz was murdered as well. Again, no one saw her body, same with Dan, but the same thing occurred. Her body was found waterlogged with various puncture wounds to the chest and face. Andrew was rescued by Castle and Solly. They found refuge at the local church alongside Father Malone and Kathy Williams and her assistant. The group now were being surrounded by what they claimed were the spirits of Blake and his crew. This is a picture taken by Andrew, I would assume because the power had been cut, they needed light. And Andrew, in a moment of panic, snapped this picture of Castle and several others, survivors of this event, to block the doors to whoever was trying to enter the room. Now, we don't have a exact image of those who attacked Antonio Bay that night. There is an artist rendition of what Nick Castle described he saw, and others corroborated, same as Stevie Wayne, who was attacked by unknown assailants. She did survive the attack on the lighthouse itself. This is an artist rendition of Blake and his leper-afflicted crew, or at least the quote-unquote spirits of them. We have nothing to really go on because there was no pictures taken that night other than the one I showed you just a moment ago. The assailants laid siege to the church, and in a moment, Father Malone took a cross forged from the gold of Blake's stolen riches and went to confront the person claiming to be Blake. The two battled over the cross until they vanished. The crew of the Elizabeth Dane vanished without a trace. It was believed to be over, but the damage was done. Now, it was believed, according to Stevie Wayne, that 6 must die as recompense for the 6 co-conspirators who murdered the crew of the Elizabeth Dane. But only 5 at that point had died. I say 5 because there was, in fact, 6. Roughly 2 hours after the event had seemingly ended, Father Malone was found by a church hand the next day, Bennett Tramer, his head severed from the rest of his body. A clean cut across his neck, a single swipe decapitation. The 6th victim of that night. What happened after, or what happened exactly, I should say, remains a mystery to this day. What Stevie Wayne shortly thereafter took her son and left Antonio Bay. Elizabeth Solly left Nick Castle shortly thereafter, and Castle himself retired. Kathy Williams stepped down as mayor after that night. It took until 5 years later that anyone spoke about that to anyone willing to listen. It's impossible to say that was it ghosts, or was it someone or a group of people looking to steal from the church or wreak havoc that night. But that doesn't explain how the bodies became so waterlogged, or the mystery of the alarms going off the night of, every clock stopping. Was it thieves putting on an elaborate ruse? Or was it Captain Blake and his crew looking for revenge for what happened 100 years ago? So, dear listener, if you ever find yourself in Antonio Bay, I ask you to go out to that beach, to go out and look out across the sea, look across the horizon, and maybe, just maybe, you'll see a fog bank roll across. I hope you all enjoyed tonight's show. It was a thrill to talk about the haunting of Antonio Bay. So I ask you, dear listener, do you believe in the haunting of Antonio Bay? Or is there a more rational explanation? But until next time, here's to a new world of gods and monsters.